Haley. So it's always nice to come and introduce new people to basically food preservation. This has been part of what we actually do and how we've actually gotten to this place in our society. So I believe it's really important for us all to learn. As you can tell, it's going to be just a very basic one. And this is what they would consider a water bath canning. And let's go ahead and get to it. Oh, here we go. So as you can see, this is Canning is Cool, and we are all about how do you preserve that produce and make it last throughout the season, because there is a limited time for it, and we want to ensure that somebody has taken the time in order to produce it. How do we take care of it afterwards? So there is a whole bunch of interchangeable terms that a lot of people use. But typically, when we are talking about jelly, we are only talking about the juice of a fruit. Okay, and then as you can see, there's jam, and that's just basically a crushed or chopped fruit, which kind of goes into the preserve round, which is the small whole fruits. And they're uniform pieces that are thick and then slightly gelled syrup. Marmalades do have some soft fruit, fruit peel, and most of the time they're often citrus for the marmalades, but I have seen some other ones. And then fruit butters are just nothing but the pulp, sugar, and spices cooked consistency. So these are the definitions that we're going to be working with. And of course, this is a jelly workshop, so it is definitely just made from the juice. As you can see, in order for this to really take form, there have to be 4 things present for it to go ahead and be a consistent gel. Sugar is 1, pectin is the 2nd, an acid is the 3rd, and then your juice is going to be the 4th. So all of these have to be in a ratio, as you can see, for it to be like come together in the consistency that you want. If you have too much sugar, it's not going to go about it at all. You're going to have a thin, runny product. If you have, if you cook it too long, you're going to have too much pectin formation. So therefore, it's going to be like really stiff. And then if you don't have the acidity, it's not going to form the bonds in between the sugar and the pectin. So as you can see, it's a very delicate balance and ratio that needs to be between all 3. Speaking of pectins, if you have taken a look at any of the jelly recipes from like the Ball Blue Book or the USDA Home Food Preservation Guide, you will find that there are a couple of different types of pectin. Now, powdered pectins are usually from citrus fruits like lemons, limes, and oranges, grapefruits. They are washed, they're ground, they're processed, they're dried, and then they're shipped off. Liquid pectins, on the other hand, are extracted from apples. If you take a look at any of the apple butter recipes, you find that there's no pectin because there's always natural available pectin from said apples to begin with. All 3 types that I'm going to be talking about are not interchangeable, okay? Yes, there is like a low sugar or a no sugar pectin, and that is a different type because it bonds with the calcium ions within the fruit, and it does need that calcium salt in order for that sugar to be reduced in said recipe. So please do not mix up any of these 3 types. Before you start doing your jelly recipe, it'll say, I need 3 cups of grape juice and 7 cups of sugar, and then I need powdered pectin. Please do not exchange it with the liquid pectin. Otherwise, it's not going to be the same, and your recipe is going to be off. Either it's going to be too runny or too stiff, especially if you add liquid pectin. So these are some of the high pectin fruits: tart apples, crab apples, sour plums, Concord grapes, quinces, gooseberries, red currants, cranberries, and citrus peels. Now the high pectin and the high acid fruits you can see here. And again, a majority of them were from the first one, but we're going to go ahead and add some more because they are high acid. These are the fruits that are low in acid or low in pectin: apples ripe, blackberries ripe, sour cherries, choke cherries, elderberries, grapefruit, grapefruit juice, grapes, loquats, and oranges. And then here are the fruits that are low in pectin and acid, which are apricots, figs, guavas, peaches, pears, plums, raspberries, and strawberries. If you have ever made like a strawberry jam, in the recipe, it actually does call for you to add in like a tablespoon or two of lemon juice. And this is because you need to bring the acid up. So when we start looking about what we're actually going to do, and we're like, I have a great idea. I'm going to make, grape jelly, right? And my neighbor's going to give me all of these grapes. If they are bad, you can't improve that by food preservation methods, right? Canning damaged food can be dangerous. There have been several instances within the last 2 years that I know of. People have been like, well, can I eat this? Can I look at this? There are a lot of things that I look at, especially when determining these things. You're going to look to see if there's like any mold, yellow, green, black. If the food is damaged, it can be like the recommended processing time may be too short to eliminate all the microbes. And I like to say during any of my canning classes, there are certain things that I do not have time for. And one of them is trips to the ER. So I like to do a whole when in doubt, throw it out type of attitude, because let's face it, I don't have time to go to the ER. That, and nobody wants to get sick, and that is part of it. There is a chance of foodborne illness, especially when you are preserving some of these things. Because let's face it, we're putting it into an environment where it has food and it's in a dark, cool place, right? And that is going to happen eventually, especially if you do not get the food preservation where you need it to be. I'd like to go back to the triangle yet again, because there's so many triangles that we need to look at, especially with food preservation. Now, how canning works is kind of along the same process of how to form a very well gel, especially within your jelly, right? And as you can see, acidity is always at the top, and then temperature is going to be to the side, and so is time. When we're talking about water bath, your temperature is always going to be at 212, because that is where it's going to boil. And within said environment in the jar. Now your time is going to be short, because a majority of the things that you are going to be doing, especially within the water bath, you're going to have a high acid content. So there is a little line that we need to talk about. What determines between high acid and low acid food? And the determination is 4.6. If you look at all of these things that are above that and going to a strong acid, you can see that a majority of them are fruits. Tomatoes are a little of the exception. As you can see, they're like 4.2, but if you've ever done like a home canned salsa, they'll always ask you to add lemon or lime juice. And as we go down that, going towards neutral, those are things that you must use a pressure canner for. Like, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Like these are the things that need to happen in order for the environment not to have those microbes present, and therefore your home food preservation is actually going to be safe. Speaking of safe, you must follow the directions. I'm so much of a stickler on this. You have to follow the directions. This little picture right here is a thermocouple. A lot of people come to me and they will say, hey, Stacey, I have a great recipe for a jam or a jelly or whatever, or a salsa even. Can I do it? And my answer 9 times out of 10 is going to be no. And the other 1/10 of the time is going to be like, this is very similar to this recipe in here. This is actually what makes sure that your jar, like the temperature within your jar, is going to be correct in order for all of those microbes and molds and everything else just to kill them. And this is what we're looking for safe canning practices, because we need to ensure that it's going to be for longevity. And the environment is what we need it to be. You are going to find specific instructions, okay, for what you are canning. Yep, go back. The Ball Blue Book is probably one of the ones that I will turn to 50% of the time. The other 50% is the USDA Home Food Preservation Guide. You want to make sure that it is a current resource from 1989 or newer, because they changed all the canning guidelines. The USDA canning guideline was revised in 2009, but it was also revised again in 2015. You want to have specific instructions, because let's face it, not like things, they are learning things all the time, especially because they have the thermocouples in order to make food as safe as possible. So here is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. You can actually go on this website and download a PDF version of their USDA. Looks kind of like this. So you can download the PDF version of it, which is nice and handy because if you are out and about, you can pull it up. The Ball Blue Book, which this is the latest version of it, and they always have a website for it. They are always changing up their recipes. They're always adding new recipes, just because that's what they do. And of course, you can ask me about a reliable source, but 9 times out of 10, I'm going to report to either one of those two because they are tried and true. There are trusted magazines and websites that you can use, but a good majority of the time, they're going towards using like gelatin and putting it in your refrigerator and using it within 3 weeks. So what was it? I was looking at a Better Homes and Gardens one the other day, and it was like put gelatin into it and then use it within the 3 weeks. And I was like, that's interesting that they didn't do a water bath recipe, but that can happen. So we've talked a lot about that, but we haven't talked about altitude and how that actually does affect the temperature of your boiling water. As you can see here in Tulsa, it is 744 feet above seawater. And so we're going to follow those guidelines that are meant for 1,000 and below feet. But a good majority of the time, if you need to, you can always put it into a pressure canner in order to bring the temperature up if you're living at a higher altitude. If you are going to be doing any recipe, you are going to want to make sure that you are choosing jars that are specifically made for canning. There are a lot of people that will come into my office and they'll be like, oh, I have a whole bunch of jars for you. And I'd be like, that's great. You know, go ahead and bring them in. I can always use more jars. A good majority of the time, it'll be like commercial used jelly jars. And I have to explain to them, you know, thank you so much for the consideration. But I can only use this kind that is for canning purposes only, because they don't realize that once you use that top for that commercially produced jar for commercially produced jelly, the seal isn't going to seal, and therefore it's going to create other things. You're going to get frustrated that it's not sealing. Speaking of this, the lids nowadays, and especially since I'm going to say 1979, have a different type of sealing compound. It's kind of a mixture. It's called plastitol. It's a mixture of, like, I do believe, plastic and silicone, which is really nice because it does ensure that it's going to have a very nice seal. But majority of the time when I was growing up, we had to boil the lids in order to put it on the jar. It's not necessary anymore. Just make sure that your lids are clean and there is nothing around the rim of the jar. So for pressure canners, you're going to place 2 to 3 inches in the bottom of the canner and put in a rack at the bottom. But we're actually talking about water bath. So this is what the inside of a water bath canner looks like. There is a rack down at the very, very bottom. And as you can see, it's like a 1/2 inch. This allows the waters to circulate around the jar. So you're doing a more even and consistent temperature raising, especially within the jar itself. There is the jar, and it says 1 to 2 inches of watering covering the jar. And that's after you put all of your jars in there in order to start the process. It says allow 1 to 2 inches of airspace for a brisk boil, because it will be boiling and you do want to make sure that it's going to go somewhere and not up and out of the pot. You want to make sure that you're keeping those jars off that hot metal, because let's face it, like I say in any majority of my canning classes, I don't have time to go to the ER. And hot jars, you know, with burns or in worst case scenarios, busting, that could happen possibly. So can you create a cooling, like basically a rack from other things? Yes, you can. You can do it from the jar rings, from other jars that you are not that you're not using currently, or you could do it from a cake cooling rack. What we're looking for is that you have a 1/2 inch of rack space in between that jar and the bottom of the pot. Please don't use a towel, because we don't need to go to the ER. You are going to cut the food all of the same size. In order for it to be into a juice, it needs to be the same size. You need to put a little water in it, and then you need to go ahead and boil it for a certain period of time. You are going to boil grapes a little bit longer, and you're going to put it through basically a strainer to ensure that all of the juice is going out. This is the different process. And you want to make sure we're going to go back. You want to ensure that you're taking all of those little air bubbles out, as you can see in the very top of that picture, like of the pictures right here. Those little bubbles are going to entrap like microbes and mold and other things that you don't want within your product. Plus, if you're doing a jelly and it's a very light liquid, you can actually see the air bubbles within it, and it doesn't make a very pretty product. You're going to fill them. The second picture is actually where she has all of her jars out and she's starting to ladle, and there is a funnel that actually fits inside of the jars, and you just ladle so that way you're not spilling hot liquid everywhere. And again, could have a risk for burns. And after you fill them, you're going to make sure that you pop all of those bubbles, and you're going to adjust your headspace. For jams and jellies, it's going to be a headspace of 1/4 inch, or if you take a look at the jar itself, that very top ring, like where it comes together, that is actually a 1/4 as well. From there, that very third picture, you're going to take a clean paper towel, you're going to wet it just a little, and you're going to wipe the rim of the jar. We do this to ensure that you're going to have a proper seal and you're not going to have to reprocess later. Plus, it's kind of sticky. So when I say adjust the headspace, you are going to have the room in between the top of the food and the bottom of the flat. And general headspaces are fruits, tomatoes, and pickles are 1/2 inch. Low acid foods are 1 to 1 1/4 inches. And then, like I said, jams and jellies, preserves are 1/4 inch or less. You're going to wipe the rim. You're going to put on your flat or your lid, and then you're going to screw your band on. This is the only reason to have a screw band on, is to keep that lid on top of that jar until you can get it processed. You do not have to store it with the band on. In fact, you should take it off to see if there has been any siphoning, which means liquid is going out of the jar. You tighten the lid correctly. So after you put the lid on, you're going to take the ring, you're going to go what they determine as finger tight. So you're going to have that first little resistance, and then you're going to give it a 1/4 turn, because you're just trying to make sure that the lid is very much down on your rim of the jar. This is a picture of when you take it out of the water bath. So you're typically going to process in between 10 to 15 minutes. This is a jar lifter. It is your best friend, especially if you're trying to move things in and out. You do select the processing times according to your recipe, right? But if your recipe says it's going to be this for a water bath and your altitude is actually different, you're going to adjust that. The jar size, you can always go down in jar size. A majority of the jellies that we're going to do requires a 1/2 pint jar size. What you're going to do is you can go down to a 1/4 pint, but you can never go up to a pint and still process at the same time. And of course, it does determine your type of canner. So you're going to let the canner cool down naturally. You're going to turn the heat off. If you're using gas heat, you may be able to leave the canner on the stove. With the electric heat or gas, you have to carefully move it over. That's just because you're trying to get it off the heat. You're trying to bring the temperature down. After it comes down to a period of cooling, you are going to use your jar lifter, pick up the jars, and then literally put them onto something else. A majority of the times you're going to have like a towel, paper, or cloth or something down so that way you can set the jars down safely. You need to have them at least 1 inch apart in order for proper cooling to happen. You need to avoid drafts because if you cool it too rapidly, it could bust, and then you're picking up sticky jelly and broken glass. You shouldn't touch them for about 12 to 24 hours, and this is to ensure that the seal is actually doing what it needs to do. Do not force it, do not invert it, do not put anything on it. You're going to let this do it naturally. And if you've done all of these steps correctly, you will audibly hear a like thunk, especially when they are sealing. So how do you test the seals to ensure that they're sealed? You're going to press down in the center of the lid with your finger or thumb. There should be no give. If you don't want to do that, you can always pick up a spoon and you can listen for the high-pitched ring when it's tapped with a spoon. Nowadays, a good majority of the canning companies have put a concave little bubble in the very center of their lids. And convex. And then after it gets sealed, it is concave, like it's almost flat. These are all of my disclaimers that I have, and if anybody needs a copy of them, please let me know. I know that was a very, very simplified version of how to make jelly or jam, but I do want you all to know that it is so important for you to follow the steps. If it is not sealed for your jars, please reprocess within 12 to 24 hours. Or put it in the refrigerator and you can use it within 3 weeks. Do we have any questions?
I actually know a person who used to do this, so I was wondering, why do we not invert the jar after we're done processing it?
So basically what you're doing when you invert that, you're just putting the heat on the lid, and while it will seal, you're trying to force the air out. Your basic job is to make sure that all of the air within said jar is out, because if you don't get all of the air in the jar out, you're actually producing that environment where it will have like the microbes and the mold and everything, and your food will spoil. So that's why they want you not to invert, is because you are forcing the seal. It will seal, but you're still keeping the air within it.
We have a question in the chat. Instead of 7 cups of sugar, can you cut that in halves? Half.
Yes. So remember when I was talking about the low or the no sugar pectin? They do have recipes for that. In fact, if you look on in a ball blue book, it will have a low or a no sugar recipe, and it actually calls for the pectins that do have low or no sugar. And you don't have to use any sugars within that because, like I said, the calcium ions are what is going to make the gel formation within said product.
There are those, I guess, air fryer things that have the different lids that you can use. And I guess they're pressure cookers. Can you use that for canning?
Okay, can you say that one more time? Are you talking about like Instapots?
Yeah.
So there are some Instapots that do have a canning application. Yes, you can use that, but you're probably going to be limited by the recipes that they have like included with them. A majority of them are only going to go to like 5 or 6 PSIGs, and therefore you can't do like, let's say, stews or meats or anything else that has low acid content. So you could, but you're going to be really limited on those recipes.
Do we have any other questions for Stacey? I'm not seeing any other questions pop through. Yes, I agree that this has been very good information, especially on the Instapot. I will be sure to follow up with the links, including the recording as well to things mentioned during this wonderful presentation. Stacey, thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge that you have shared with us. I know I learned quite a bit, so I'm looking forward to putting this to use and trying out some new jams and jellies, because I just learned a lot about the pH and sugar and no sugar. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for participating today.
Thank you, everybody.